Today's lecture, the real one, is underwritten by the Richard W. and Jeanette D. Collenberg Lectureship Fund. After visiting Chautauqua as a child, Richard later brought his family, and they've come back almost every summer for 53 years. Richard was a writer, a teacher, and a Presbyterian minister. His wife, Jeanette, has been a very engaged Chautauquan for many years as a member of the Bird Tree and Garden Club, a member of the CLSC class of 2000, a Chautauqua Fund volunteer, and on the boards of the Chautauqua Women's Club and the Presbyterian Association. Please join me in thanking the Collenberg family for helping to make today's lecture possible. Before I introduce David, I have a funny story to share. We were at an Interfaith Youth Corps gathering in Washington. It was my first opportunity to introduce myself as president. And he said some version of, "Have I done something wrong? You haven't invited me back to Chautauqua recently." Nothing could be further from the truth, and certainly this is one of the days we've been most looking forward to all season. So returning is David Brooks, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times since 2003. One of the foremost commentators on politics and culture in our time, Mr. Brooks makes regular appearances on NPR's All Things Considered, NBC's Meet the Press, and the PBS NewsHour. He also teaches at Yale University and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Mr. Brooks has authored several best-selling books, including The Social Animal, The Hidden Sources of Love, Character and Achievement, and most recently, The Road to Character. Previously, Mr. Brooks wrote at the Wall Street Journal, where he was posted in Brussels, covering Russia, the Middle East, South Africa, and European affairs, before becoming the paper's op-ed editor. He's also served as a senior editor at the Weekly Standard and contributing editor at both Newsweek and The Atlantic. In March, Mr. Brooks was named executive director of the Aspen Institute, where he'll spearhead a bold new project aiming at bridging the differences that divide Americans and seeking out a compelling common ground. Pertinent to the larger conversation on American identity this week, in The Road to Character, Mr. Brooks writes, and I quote, "Success leads to the greatest failure, which is pride. Failure leads to the greatest success, which is humility and learning. In order to fulfill yourself, you have to lose yourself." If we're losing our American identity, as so many Americans believe, it's a relief to have David Brooks here as part of this week to help us find it again. He's joined on this return Chautauqua trip by his wife Anne, and we're delighted to have them both. Please welcome back to the amphitheater platform, David Brooks.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been 5 years since I've been here, but I'm 10 years older. And this place is about, 30 or 40% bigger than last time, and I'm 30 or 40% worse, so it'll balance. I was just reminded driving in here, and I mentioned because Richard Collenberg was Presbyterian minister, you're reminded when you come here again of the legacy of this place, and mostly the spiritual depth of this place. There are a lot of ideas festivals, but as you drive through and you see the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church and the Episcopal Church, even the Chabad House, you're reminded that America wasn't only built on a certain set of ideas, but it was a spiritual legacy. And it was a beautiful spiritual legacy that's worth bringing back. I don't know how many of you have seen a movie about another Presbyterian minister named Fred Rogers. I just saw this movie last week, and it's weird, like all around. It's a movie about a guy taking off his jacket, going into a closet, putting on a sweater, changing his shoes, talking to kids. And all around me, and me too, people are just crying throughout the movie. And they're crying because he was such a good man. And goodness is in short supply, at least on the public realm. And it was just such a relief to see that kind of goodness. And it wasn't only his native goodness, but he was drawing on a long tradition of goodness. There's one scene in a famous biography, or a profile written of Mr. Rogers by Tom Judeau, who's a great journalist for Esquire. And there's a kid who has a very bad cerebral palsy, and he's coming up to Rogers, and he can't speak and he can't walk. And Rogers says to him, "Would you pray for me?" And Trudeau says later, that was so nice, you had the kid pray for you because he'll think you're close to God and it'll make him feel good about himself. And Rogers said, no, that's not why I asked him to pray for me. I asked him to pray for me because someone who has gone through so many challenges must be truly close to God. And I was asking for his intercession on my behalf. And so Rogers was coming out of a tradition where the weak were closer to God than the strong, the children closer to God than the adults, the marginalized closer to God than the celebrated. And that's actually a deep tradition in American life and in American spiritual life that we seem to have managed to leave behind. And it came out of basically the mainline Protestantism of this place and this culture. A few years later, Rogers heard about a school shooting. A kid went to a school one day in Kentucky, this was back in 1997, and said, I'm going to do something big tomorrow. And he came back to school the next day and he shot 8 people, 3 of whom died. And when Rogers heard about it, he said, imagine if he'd come to school and said, I'm going to do something little tomorrow. And Rogers was all about the beauty of little things done with great love. And that didn't just flow, that flowed from places like this and traditions like this. And so one of the nice things about coming here is that you don't get to go to an ideas festival. I go to a lot of ideas festivals. But you get to come to a place that has a certain spiritual tradition and a spiritual root. And the ideas are embedded in that thing. And I emphasize that because normally I come from a world where the spirit is not evident, but the ideas are strong. And I grew up, I'm a bookish person. When I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided I wanted to become a writer. And I remember in high school I wanted to date a woman named Bernice, and she didn't want to date me, she wanted to date some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. And so we had different values. And then when I was 18, the admissions officers at Wesley and Columbia and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And some of you probably know the obsolete line about Chicago, it's where fun goes to die. My favorite line about it, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And so it is a bookish place that students wear t-shirts, sure it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And so I went there as sort of a bookish student. I had a double major in history and celibacy while I was there. And so I teach now at Yale. I only teach at schools I couldn't have gotten into. And I didn't have some of the skills my students have. My students are doing all this amazing community service. It's like, you ask them, what are you doing at spring break? It's like, I'm going to unicycle across Thailand while reading to lepers, that sort of thing. But I did do some things that were that my students do. I was able to dominate classroom discussion while doing none of the reading, specialty. And I managed a boxer, that is true, called the Kosher Killer. And we decided to train for boxing, not by the University of Chicago way. We wouldn't actually practice. We just read books about boxing. And he actually made it to the semifinals of the Chicago Golden Gloves through a series of buys. So his first match was in the semifinals, and he'd never boxed before in his life. He's in the heavyweight division, and he comes out swinging like this. The other boxer shoots back in the corner. He has no idea what's coming at him. And then 92 seconds later, he realizes, well, one uppercut ends this fight, and that's pretty much what happened. And so all that is to say, it's a bookish life that I led early on. I went out and became a conservative columnist at the New York Times, which is a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca, not a lot of company all the time. And then I do a show on PBS, which is sort of, for TV, it's a bookish show called The NewsHour on PBS. Thank you. We do a segment called Shields and Brooks. We wanted to call it Brooke Shields. That would have been better, but they didn't go for it. Mark is an experienced, seasoned pundit. The segment is now called Shields and Brooks. Before that, it was Shields and Chigo. I think before that was Shields and Gergen, and then Shields and Coolidge, and I think it started out as Shields and Machiavelli. It goes back a ways. And our audience is also somewhat seasoned. If a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your show, but my mother loves it. We do extremely well in the hospice community there. But it is kind of bookish and super intellectual. I learned to try to appear smarter than I really am. I read an article recently about how you do that. If you're in a meeting and somebody mentions a percentage, turn it into a fraction. So if somebody says, 25%, you should say, 1 in 4. That seems really smart. And so my life has been about books. And as you get older, you get a little more feminine in your reading taste. I'm the only American male who finished that book, Eat, Pray, Love, if you know that book. By page 123, I was actually lactating, which was amazing. And then I wrote a book called The Social Animal a few years ago, a book about emotion. And my friends joked that me writing a book about emotion was like Gandhi writing a book about gluttony. It's not the normal thing. And then a few years ago, I published this book, The Road to Character, about character. And writing that book, I learned that just writing a book about character doesn't give you good character. And even reading a book about character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book about character does give you good character. So I recommend that. And so all this is, my whole bias is toward the intellectual, toward the brain up here, the neck up. And yet one of the things that occurs to you as you go through life, and especially in a place like this, is that the cognitive rational part of our brain is only the third most important part of our consciousness. And the first is the desiring heart. I met a guy who bought a bamboo stand, or bought a house not long ago, and there was a bamboo stand by the driveway. And for understandable reasons, he didn't like bamboo. So he chopped down the bamboo, he took an axe to the root system, and then he dug a hole 3 feet deep and dumped plant poison in the hole. Then he covered it over with 3 feet of gravel and about 6 inches of concrete. And 2 years later, you know what's coming. A little shoot of bamboo sticks up through the concrete. And in my view, we all have something like that. We all have some piece of us which is our desire, which pushes through anything. We are what the writer Jamie Smith called existential sharks. We're always on the move. We're always desiring. And sometimes the desires can sneak up on us out of nowhere. So a friend of mine told me this story about a woman in Houston who was engaged to a guy in San Francisco, and she was a pianist, and she decided before she moved to San Francisco to be with their fiancé, she would get her hair done. So she goes to a salon called Etude de Paris, and she looks at the guy cutting somebody else's hair. She goes back to the back room to put on her gown. She calls her mother and says, "I've just seen the man I'm actually going to marry." She comes out, gets shampooed, sitting in the chair. She asks the bar the guy's name, the stylist. His name is David, French guy. And he asked her story, and she said, "Well, I'm a concert pianist. I'm about to move to San Francisco to be with my fiancé, but I won't do it if you'll marry me." And David looked down, as he describes it, David looked down on the scissors, and he said, "I never felt more free than I did at that instant." And he said, "It's a deal." And they've been married for 17 years now. And so sometimes love just sneaks up on you. But what the heart really wants is not just the instant love, but a deep fusion with another soul. The kind of fusion that Louis de Bernier described in his book, Captain Corelli's Mandolin. He is an old guy in that book talking to his daughter about his relationship with his late wife. And the old guy says, "Love itself is what is left over when being in love is burned away. And this is both an art and a fortunate accident. Your mother and I had it. We had roots that grew toward each other underground, and when all the pretty blossoms had fallen from our branches, we found out that we were one tree and not two." And so that's, I think, what is the heart's desire. The second most important part of our consciousness is our yearning soul. Now, I don't ask you to believe in God or not believe in God. That's not really in my department. But I ask you to believe that you have a soul. I ask you to believe that you have a piece of you which has no shape, size, color, or weight, but is of infinite value and dignity. That rich and successful people don't have more of this thing than poor and less successful people. That older people don't have more of it than younger people. That slavery is wrong because it insults another human being's soul. That rape is wrong not because it's an assault on a bunch of physical molecules, but it's assault and indignity on another human being's soul. And that obscenity is anything that covers over another person's soul. And what this soul does is it yearns for righteousness. I've covered rapes, I've covered crime, and I've met people who've done awful things. I've never met anybody who didn't want to lead a good life. And even the people who do terrible things have some rationale for why what they did was at least excusable but actually good. Because we all are driven to lead this sort of good life. And when we see somebody who's lead a good life, we see a spiritual joy and peacefulness in them that we yearn for, the elevation, frankly, that Fred Rogers had. I was seated at a Washington luncheon a couple weeks ago, or years ago now, and I was seated next to the Dalai Lama. And this guy radiates that internal joy and spirit and peace of soul. And because of that, he just laughs for no apparent reason. And so he started laughing, and I wanted to be polite, so I laughed, and then he would laugh, and I would laugh. And I had nothing to say to the guy, but he had a little canvas Dalai Lama bag, and so I said, "You got any candy in your bag?" And so he starts pulling out all this stuff in the bag. It's basically everything you get in the first-class cabin of an international flight. It's like a little razor, ear thing. But he did have a Toblerone bar. And so that soul, it wants that kind of peace. And I've noticed, but the weird thing about the soul, it's reclusive. It's like some leopard or something that's up in the hills. And earlier in your life, you can ignore it. You're working on your career, you're working on your family, and the soul's just up there, and you see it through the trees occasionally. Occasionally you'll have a bad night when you can't sleep, and as a poet says, your thoughts come to you like a drawer full of knives. Occasionally there'll be a moment of joy, and your heart will swell up. But I think there's a moment in every life where the leopard up in the hills comes and sits in the room in front of you and asks you for your justification. Why did you come here? What good have you served? What is the purpose of your life? And the people who have given those questions no thought have to live with that fact. But most people have given it thought, and they have dedicated their lives to some moral purpose. And I find this especially true later in life. I notice when I interview people over 60 or 70, their lives take on what I call the two-mountain shape. They got out of college, they started building their career, and they said, that's my mountain to climb. I'm going to become a lawyer, a teacher, I'm going to raise my family. And sometimes in middle age, they reach the top of the mountain, and it's not quite as satisfying as they thought it would be. Or they fall down to the mountain, into the valley, they get fired, they have a tragedy, they lose a child. And the weird thing about being down in the valley is the vision is actually clearer from down there. Paul Tillich, the theologian, said what suffering does is it carves through the floor of what we thought was the basement of our soul and reveals a cavity below that, and carves through that and reveals a cavity below. And when you see the depth of yourself, you realize there's only a spiritual food that can fulfill those cavities. And when they're in the depth, they realize, well, that first mountain, that wasn't actually my mountain. There's something else I'm going to do with my life, which is a second mountain. And if the first mountain is about building up the ego and establishing your mark in the world, the second mountain tends to be about pouring forth, about giving back, about service. I ran into a guy who in Tennessee recently was a banker for 25 years. He quit, became a pastor. That didn't really work. And then now he works with men coming out of prisons, helping them readjust to the world. And the guy glows with the fulfillment. He's on his second mountain. He's found what he was meant to do. And the second mountain tends to be a bigger one, an inner one, and a spiritual one. And when people have fulfilled that mountain and fulfilled their soul, they experience a kind of moral joy. And I think what we aim for is moral joy. Moral joy is what you get when you are part of a group of people pursuing an ideal. And so Rabbi Wolf Kellman was marching in Selma with King, and he described the experience. He said, "What we felt connected in song to the transcendental, the ineffable. We felt triumph and celebration. We felt that things change for the good and nothing is congealed forever. That was the warmest transcendental spiritual experience. Meaning and purpose and mission were beyond exact words. Meaning was the feeling, the song, the moment of overwhelming spiritual fulfillment. And so when people are fulfilling the yearnings of their heart and their soul, they're with each other, they're moving in unison, but they're moving in unison on behalf of some ideal, and they lose track of where they end and the other person starts. That's the essence of a joyful experience. You forget where the skin barrier is. You're part of something. The poet David White said, "Joy is a meeting place of deep intentionality and self-forgetting, the bodily alchemy of what lies inside us in communion with what formerly seemed outside of us, but now is neither. Dance, laughter, affection, skin touching skin, singing in the car, music in the kitchen, the quiet, irreplaceable, companionable presence of a daughter." It's when people are really coming together in love on behalf of something good. And so, when you start from that premise that we're primarily desiring, loving creatures and we yearn for the good, you come to this weird phenomenon that our society has become a conspiracy against this kind of moral joy. And I guess you could trace it back to hundreds of years ago. René Descartes tried to separate the mind from the body and reason from the emotions, and we started a whole series of systems that divide us up. And so a lot of schools you go to, they treat students like they're just brains on a stick. They're just going to download information, and they're going to ignore the spiritual and emotional parts of their lives. We have a new elite meritocracy that's defined by grades and SAT scores, as if worth really inheres in intelligence more than anything else. We have an industrial revolution that tries to reduce people to physical cogs in a machine. We have a reductionist tendency to divide every problem into its smallest piece. And as my colleague at Yale said, Tony Kronman, in the research universities, we divide every problem into specialization, which yields a lot of good research benefits. But the problem is we never encourage students to stand back and say, well, what is the question about the whole of my lives? What's the entirety of my life amounting up to? And it's the specialization leads us to say, don't worry about the soul behind the curtain. And it leads to a lack of moral articulateness and a lack of sense of moral purpose. And the final thing we've done, and this we've done as a country, is the heart and the soul are bonding mechanisms. It's what bond us to one another. We have had a culture that's been individualistic for the past 60 years. And so it started, if you wanted to start a little history of American society over the last 50 years, you could start with the period between 1932 and, say, 1968. And this was a culture that had to face depression and war, and it was very group-oriented. People joined big organizations, the Army, the labor unions, GM, and they had tight communities. If you lived on Chicago's South Side, you probably followed your father into the Nabisco plant where he followed his father. You probably joined the same union. In those days, there wasn't much air conditioning and there wasn't much TV, so the kids ran between the houses, the doors were open, and they had super tight communities. There were barbecues, coffee clutches, babysitting cooperatives. If somebody asked you, where are you from, you didn't say, I'm from Chicago. You said, I'm from 59th and Pulaski, because your crossroads was the neighborhood, the tight neighborhood where you were from. There was a guy named John Ferry who was running for office in the Illinois state legislature. And he didn't just run for office as a member of his own party, as an independent. In those days, if you ran for office, you ran as part of the machine. So he ran to be part of Boss Daley's machine. And he represented Mayor Daley, and then at the end of his career, Daley said, well, you've done us 20 years of good service in Springfield. I'm going to give you 2 years in Washington just as a reward. And so the reporters asked him, how are you going to vote when you get to Washington? And he said, well, I'll go to Washington to represent Mayor Daley. For 21 years, I represented the mayor in the legislature, and he was always right. And so that was deference to an organization. That was a tight community. And there's something about that culture which was deeply admirable. The tightness of the bonds, the social bonds, is something we miss today. There was a lot of humility. But there were a lot of things about that group-oriented culture of the 30s, 40s, 50s, which we don't regret. There was a lot of racism, there was a lot of sexism, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, there was a lot of emotional coldness, the food was really bad, And so what happens is when people get sick of a collective culture, they chop it up. They say, this is not working for us anymore. And starting in 1962 with the Port Huron Statement and Betty Friedan and the whole movement of the 60s, people chopped up that culture. And they created a much more individualistic culture. And to me, a symptomatic moment of that cultural shift happened in an early event in my childhood, which was Super Bowl III, which was fought between the New York Jets and the Baltimore Colts, about 1969 or 70. And there were two quarterbacks on the field at the end of the game who were both from Western Pennsylvania, just from a few miles apart, but 10 years apart in age. One of them was Johnny Unitas. He was a typical 1950s guy, crew-cut hair, high-top shoes. He played like a plumber. He was a great quarterback, but it was a workman-like style, not a showy style. He just got the job done. On the other side of the field, there was a guy who was my childhood hero named Broadway Joe Namath. He wore $5,000 fur coats, posed for pantyhose ads, long hair. He was a swinger. He wrote a memoir called I Can't Wait Until Tomorrow Because I Get Better Looking Every Day. And so that Johnny Unitas would not have written that memoir. And so suddenly there had been a shift in culture, from reticence to expression. Young was cool, not old. It was better to be casual than not formal, to be a rebel, not a conformist, to be individual, not institutional. And so that shift had some great effects. The individual culture gave us the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, the peace movement, the age of Aquarius, rock and roll. I don't think we could have had the creativity of Silicon Valley if we didn't have that highly individualistic, entrepreneurial, rebel culture. It's led to some bad things. Every idea becomes false when you take it to its extreme. And we've had 40 or 50 years of individualism, and we've sort of run out the string. It's led to a whole series of cultural things which are a bit extreme. One is the emphasis on self and the rise of a big me culture of narcissism. Scientists have a test where they say, I'm going to read you a bunch of statements. Does this apply to you? It's called the Narcissism Test. And they're statements like, I find it easy to manipulate people because I'm so extraordinary. Or, I love to look at my body. Or, somebody should write a biography about me. The median narcissism score has gone up 30% in the last 20 years. Americans score 25th or 26th in math performance around the world. If you ask Americans, are you really good at math? We're number one in the world in thinking we're really good at math. Along with this rise of narcissism has gone a great desire for personal fame. It used to be young people were not that interested in being famous. Now it ranks number 2 or 3 about what college freshmen want out of life. So some junior high school girls in one study were asked, would you rather be a celebrity's personal assistant, Justin Bieber's personal assistant, or president of Harvard? And by 3 to 1, they said they'd rather be Justin Bieber's personal assistant. Though to be fair, I asked the president of Harvard, and she said she would rather be Justin Bieber. Similar study, college students were asked, would you like to lead a life that involves a lot of sex or a lot of fame? And by 2 to 1, they chose the life with a lot of fame. And so when I go to college campuses, I say, listen, I'm on TV twice a week. I read a column in a prominent paper. I'm kind of famous. Go with the sex. It's better. And so along with the excesses of individualism has led to 4 overlapping social crises we're suffering from today. The first is a crisis of isolation. If you asked Americans 30 years ago, are you lonely? 20% said yes. Now 40% say yes. 35% of Americans over 45 are chronically lonely. In 1970, married couples entertained friends in their home an average of 15 times a year. Now it's 8 times a year. Only 8% of Americans say they have meaningful conversations with their neighbors. The fastest growing religious movement is unaffiliated. The fastest growing political party is unaffiliated. Suicide rates have been rising since 1999, and now 45,000 people commit suicide every year, twice as many as die in car crashes, and suicide is just a proxy for loneliness. 55,000 people die of opiate addiction, and opiate addiction is just slow motion suicide. The second crisis is an institutional crisis of alienation. Back in that earlier group era, that we're all in this together era, 80% of people trusted the institutions of their society. Now it's down to about 22%. Back in that earlier era, if you asked people, do you trust the people around you, your friends? 60% said, yeah, my people around me are trustworthy. Now 32% of Americans trust their friends, and only 19% of millennials trust their friends. The lower you go in the age bracket, the higher levels of social distrust. And that decline in trust is not a matter of perception, it's reality. It's because people are less trustworthy. And that has led to this alienation, this isolation. And the third is a crisis of meaning, a crisis of purpose. It's amazing to me, given all that we've learned about the brain, that depression rates are going up, not down. That mental health problems are on the upswing, not the downswing. I notice it in my students. If you ask them, they're amazing kids, they got into Yale, they're amazing. They get out of college, and they have a setback at 24, 25. And I've come to expect the calls. They've been crushed. They get fired, they lose their job, they have a romantic breakup, and there's a devastation in their voice. Nietzsche has a phrase, he who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. He who has a why to live for can endure anyhow. But if you don't know the why of your life, when the setbacks come, you fall, because you don't know the long purpose. And I see the fragility, and it's not their fault, it's our fault. We have given them no moral vocabulary with which to tackle the challenges of life. Look at the commencement cliches. They're getting out of college, and this is their final day in college, and they're going to the commencement, and they want to know, where do they plant themselves? What do they do with their lives? And we say, be free. Be free. Freedom is great. Explore your options. The future is limitless. They've got enough freedom. They want to know where to plant themselves, on what criteria to judge. So we give them another empty box, the empty box of possibility. The future is limited. Take risks. They don't know what to take risks for. Upon which do they judge anything? So they ask us, well, what authority figures do I go to in searching for what I should do with my life? We give them another empty box, which is the empty box of autonomy. Follow your own passion. You do you. Listen to your own heart. Beat to your own drummer. Well, the you is exactly the thing that hasn't formed. David Foster Wallace described it well. He described a sadness, something that doesn't have much to do with physical circumstances or the economy or the stuff that gets talked about on the news. It's more like a stomach-level sadness. I see it in myself and my friends in different ways. It manifests itself in a kind of lostness. This is a generation that has been inheritance of absolutely nothing when it comes to meaningful moral values. We've passed them down nothing except individualism and freedom and openness, and not even a moral vocabulary to find out how they can come together or to what they can dedicate their lives. And when you leave people naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. And that's pretty much what's happened. We have tribal mentality. Tribal mentality is a scarcity mentality. There's scarce resources. It's us versus them. It's friend, enemy. And the politics is tribal. We now have what we call in political science negative polarization. Do you like your own party? Not really. Do you hate the other side? Totally. And so our politics is more driven by hatred than it is by affiliation. And you get this zero-sum mentality. It's a warrior mentality. Politics is war. Ideas are compact. Mistrust is our worldview. Build walls, erect barriers. I spent about 7 or 8 months ago, I spent an afternoon with Steve Bannon. And it was fun, actually. It was like being with Trotsky in 1905. It was like, he had, this 100 years time span. He had his international allies, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, Nigel Farage. Trump was just one phase in the grand plan. And he said, your version of community leaves people nothing. I give them community. We give them community. And so he was convinced he was right. And between 1990 and 1995, I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal in Europe, and I covered amazing good news. I covered the fall of the Berlin Wall, the German reunification, the end of the Soviet Union, Mandela coming out of prison in South Africa, the end of apartheid, the Oslo peace process in the Middle East, European Union, just one good news story after another. The one story at the end that I barely paid attention to was the Yugoslav Civil War. Bosnia, Serbia, Milosevic, if you remember. It turns out that was the most important thing I covered, because that rise of ethnic nationalism, that rise of tribalism, predicted the next 25 years of world history. And so we're suddenly, unexpectedly, we're in a world of rising tribal identity based on us, them, based on hatred, based on walls. And so when I think about the moment we're in, I think about George H.W. Bush walking across the Yale campus in 1941, hearing about Pearl Harbor, and enlisting. And we don't have something as dramatic as Pearl Harbor, but when the foundations of democracy are being shredded, isn't that a silent Pearl Harbor? When the foundations of capitalism, the free movement of goods and people are being threatened, it seems to me it's a silent Pearl Harbor. When the basic norms of truth are being broken, that seems like a silent Pearl Harbor. When 55,000 people die of opiate addiction and 45,000 every year of suicide, that seems like a silent Pearl Harbor. And so we're not going to be asked, as earlier generations were asked, what did you do in the war? But I think we will be asked, what did you do in the peace? What did you do to build this peace and make this country come together at a time when tribalism was on the rise? And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about how do countries turn around? How do you get a country that seems to be dividing and bring it back together? And the classic example is war. We get united around an enemy. And so I used to joke it would be nice if we got invaded by Canada, but recently that seems like it actually might happen, so I don't say that anymore. But there is a case where you do see actual America turning itself around. And it was America between 1880 and 1910. It was a time where America had just been through this very individualistic culture called social Darwinism. It was a time of great economic transition to industrialization. It was a time of ethnic migration sweeping across the country. It was a time of intense political corruption. And so what happened? How did they do it? Well, the shift came in 3 waves. The first happened right here. There was a shift from the social Darwinism, which was super selfish, to what they called the social gospel movement, which is super collective. We're all in this together, and that happened right here at Chautauqua. Second, after you had the religious revival and a shift in mentality, you had a civic revival. You had an amazing wave of civic institution building. So around the 1890s, within 5 years, you had all these great organizations that got built all at once. The Boy and Girl Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the NAACP, the labor unions, the Settlement House movement, the environmental movement, the temperance movement. They built all these amazing organizations. Basically, they said, we have all these civic groups to raise American young people, but they're built on the idea that American young people are raised on the prairie. But now we've got millions of kids in Chicago and New York and Philadelphia. What do we do with them? And they responded with great civic creativity. And the third thing was a political movement. All those civic organizations got together and said, we're all one thing. We're all one movement. And they became the progressive movement with Teddy Roosevelt. And then they got out of that the clean government campaigns, the Federal Reserve System, the civil service, the regulatory agencies. So it was religious and spiritual first, civic second, political third. So you look around today, are we seeing a religious revival? Well, there's not really much evidence of that. Are we seeing a political revival? Well, I live in Washington. I can guarantee you politics will be the lagging indicator of our national renewal. But we are seeing a civic revival. There are hundreds of groups that have long existing and thousands of groups that are just starting as people decide, especially since the last election, I'm going to get involved, I'm going to do something. And I now spend half my time at the Aspen Institute at a project called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. What we do is we want to take all these local community groups and we want to bind them into a national movement. In the 60s, we had segregation, so we had a civil rights movement that rose to combat it. Feminism rose to combat gender inequality. We had pollution, so we had an environmental movement. Now we have an isolation movement, or an isolation problem. Why shouldn't we have a community movement that arises to combat it? And so now I get the chance to meet, I get the chance now to go around the country and meet amazing people who are building community. I ran into a guy in Shreveport, Louisiana named Mac McCarter. He's one of these golden, incandescent people. He walks into a coffee shop, and within 3 minutes, he knows everybody. Within 5 minutes, they all want him to officiate the wedding. He's just like one of those guys. And he came back to Shreveport, which is a racially and economically divided city, and he drove to a black neighborhood. He's a white guy, and he drove to a black neighborhood, and he said, I'm just going to start making friends here. And he was scared the first time he did it. He just drove in, and he said, maybe I'll just do a drive-by blessing. Maybe that'll be enough. But he got out of the car, he knocked on the door, and of course he was greeted by distrust. Understandably, people have been coming to these communities to lie to them for years. But he came back every Saturday morning for 3 years. And there are about, I don't know how many people, 250,000 people in Shreveport. 55,000 are volunteers in his organization. They all wear We Care buttons, and they put We Care signs in their yard, and in every block on that city, there's a hospitality house, a haven house, a settlement house that creates community in the block and between blocks. And yeah, I see these people are everywhere. Some of them are motivated to do it because of a hole in their lives. Not long ago, I met a guy named Darius from Washington, D.C. When Darius was 9, his father left his mom and had an affair with a stripper who then contracted to have him killed. So Darius lost his dad in this way when he was 9. And now Darius is back in that neighborhood creating summer camps. I ran into a woman named Sarah who grew up in Indiana. Her father reported on the embezzlement of their pastor, and instead of shunning the pastor, they shunned her family. So for 8 years of her childhood, she was isolated from her family, extended family, and from her town. She now runs an organization called Thread in Baltimore to create community to make up for the hole that she had to suffer as a young child. So some of them have done this amazing, they're just recovering from that hole they had. A lot of them had no defining tragedy. They just have a narrative in their minds that says, I was blessed, others suffer, that must change. And so you see a wide range among the community builders of what's motivating them. But there are two things I find in common. One is radical humility. Every single person I've met violently rejects the idea that they're helping others less fortunate themselves. The attitude is always, we're all in this together, working out our stuff together. A lot of them hate the word charity. One of them banned the word mentorship, because it's not like I'm up here teaching you down there. It's we're all in this together. We're all broken. We're all working out our stuff. The second attitude I've noticed is vocational certitude. They have good days and bad days, but they're all utterly convinced, this is my calling, this is what I'm meant to do, I'm going to die doing this, this is why God put me on this earth. It's comforting to be around people who have that. More important than the people, though, is the institutions they're building. It's great to be a good person and to really dedicate yourself in selfless love, but you got to build an institution that will create relationship. And so they all have technologies for how do I create vulnerability and relationship. In Chicago, there's a group called Becoming a Man, where they have what they call the check-in. And so it's gang members from the West Side, all men. And they have to sit in a little room, and they have to check in and say how they're doing spiritually, emotionally, physically, and intellectually. And if they aren't fully vulnerable with the other men in the room, they get castigated. You're not showing up for us. Sarah in Baltimore, her organization is called Thread. They've got 450 students in the Baltimore schools who have an average GPA in the beginning of 0.45. They build 4 parents, 4 volunteers above each child, and then 4 grandparents above that, and then an extended family all around that. And because everybody has a phone, the kids and the volunteers, they can tell when the kids are next to the volunteers because through location technology. And they call it the Fitbit of social relationship. They can measure who is touching the kid, for how long, when the kid has gone 3 hours without being touched. They're creating relationship and technology. 30 cities asked Thread to spread to their city, and Sarah said no to all of them because she loves Baltimore. She wears a necklace with Baltimore on the necklace. These people are motivated not only by the love of the good, by the love of their place. They're all fiercely patriotic in a local sense. And so one of the things you notice about them is they're renegotiating power structures. When I was young, all the big movements were masses of local chapters with a famous person on top. Martin Luther King, Ralph Nader, Gloria Steinem, Ronald Reagan. If you look at the movements that are thriving today, they have no leaders. Black Lives Matters, Me Too, Tea Party. It's a radically decentralized power structure, and these organizations are figuring that out. But what they do have is an ethos. They have a strong ethos. Some organizations are thick and some are thin. Some you pass through, a school or a company, doesn't leave a mark on you. But some organizations are thick because they have a strong ethos. You know who a Marine is. They've been in the Marine Corps. You know who a Morehouse man is. They've gone through Morehouse College. They have this thickness and this identity. And I've been thinking, what makes a thick organization versus a thin one? Because all the groups I really admire, they're thick. One, they have a physical location, often cramped, where people meet face to face, or around a dinner plate, or something like that, or a packed gym. They have a set of collective rituals, shared tasks that involve closely watching each other. They sleep overnight somewhere at a retreat center so they can see each other late at night and before they put on the makeup in the morning. They often have a moment where the organization nearly failed and they survive through some act of generosity. They have clearly defined shared goals, a sacred guidebook, a label. They're not afraid to be themselves. Some colleges and some organizations, they're just like every other college. But if you go to the University of Chicago, where I went, you go to Wheaton, where my wife went, those institutions are very distinct. You may love them or you may hate them, but they are distinct and they are thick. And so these organizations are everywhere. And what they do is they repair the spirit one by one. Emerson had a phrase, souls are not saved in bundles. They're saved one by one. And they're saved by relationship one by one. I'm involved in a community of young men and women in D.C. It's hosted by a couple named Kathy and David. And Kathy and David their kid had a friend who had no place to stay because his mom had some drug issues. So they said, well, James can stay with us. And James had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And now when you go into Kathy and David's houses, there's mattresses all across the floor. And when you go to the dinner on Thursdays, they've got 30 or 40 kids, and often it's the first dinner they've had at a dinner table in 10 or 11 years, and they come back. And I show up as my middle-aged white self, and I meet the kids about 4 years ago, and I reach out to shake a kid's hand, and he says, we don't really shake hands here. We hug here. And so I've been hugging for 4 years ever since, like getting used to this, guys. But what that does is it gets you to relationship, to intimacy. The chief barrier to relationship is fear. We're all afraid of being judged and rejected. We're a fear of disapproval. We're afraid of exposing our tender flesh. We get inhibited. And Gary Shandling said, my friends say I have an intimacy problem, but they don't really know me. But intimacy happens when somebody shares something emotionally meaningful and the other person receives it and shares it back. When you share the important moments of your life, phase by phase, moment by moment. And there's sort of a moral testing in the creation of intimacy. If I unveil myself to you, will you protect me? If I proceed cautiously, will you understand me and match my pace? If I pause, will you respect my pause and wait for me? If I reveal my scariest dark monsters, will you reveal yours and protect that? There's no shortcut to this kind of relationship building. Trust is not, I'll solve your problems. Trust is just, I'm here for you. And so cultures change when people find a superior way to live. Often people on the margins of society find a superior way to live, and then other people copy them. And to me, what's happening with these community groups is they're finding a superior way to live. They're creating trust, creating relationships. They are the answer to our national problems. The problem right now is they're only doing it in small pockets. They're like Italian hillsides. They're up on the top of the mountain, and they've got a great community, but down in the valley, it's still where it was. And so what we've got to do is take them as exemplars and tell the country, be like those people, you be like those people, you build relationship, you copy those people, take it into your own life, and that way shift the culture and have a radiating effect. And that's what our little Aspen thing, and I hope what you will do. People change the culture by writing books often. Harriet Beecher Stowe, Frederick Douglass, Tolstoy, Dickens changed the imagination of England. These people are writing books with their own lives, and we just have to edit and publish and broadcast it to shift the culture and have a new sort of exemplar. One of the things we lost as a country is a cohering national narrative. I was raised really with an immigrant mentality. It was an exodus narrative. And the narrative said, we left the wilderness, we crossed the ocean, and we came to the promised land. The Puritans came with that narrative. The founders wanted that narrative. Benjamin Franklin wanted to put Moses on the Great Seal of the United States because that was our narrative. Every subsequent immigrant group believed in that narrative. Martin Luther King talked more about Exodus than he did about the New Testament. And yet we have to face the reality, for a lot of young people, that narrative makes no sense to them. They just don't buy that this is a promised land. There's been too much oppression, too much unfairness. And so to me, the narrative that we have to come up with is a new narrative of commitment with each other. And it's a commitment based on redemption and forgiveness. That we are a beautiful experiment that has occasionally been betrayed. But we can redeem that betrayal. The great moment in this redemption story is Lincoln's second inaugural. He knew he was going to win the Civil War at that point. He could have said, we won, you lost. We were right, you defended slavery, you were wrong. But the key words in that speech are us, all, our, and them. It's all unifying words. Slavery wasn't a Southern problem, it was an American problem. We all had to purge the sin of that problem. It was falling in love with the country and then sacrificing on behalf of it, community by community. And I'll come back to where I started, the power of love in those bamboo shoots. When my kid was born, my eldest, he was in Brussels, and he had a super low APGAR score. And what happens when a kid happens and is sick at birth, they whisk him away. And so he's up in the intensive care ward, and you don't know what's going to happen. And so I remember thinking that night, suppose he only lives 30 minutes. Will it be worth a lifetime of grief for his mother and I? And if you had asked me before he was born, I said, no, ridiculous. How could the 30 minutes of consciousness for a creature who's not even aware of he believes he's alive, how could that be worth a lifetime of grief for two human beings? But parents will attest that after he was born, suddenly it seemed totally worth it. His life had infinite dignity immediately. And at that moment, you're seized by a level of commitment and a level of love you don't even know is possible. And when a parent is seized by that love, you start doing more selfless things than you were capable of before. You want to go running, but you got to push the baby carriage. And you become a slightly better person because that love sucks you into being a better person. It doesn't seem that hard. And that love is something we have for our children. And that love is something we often have for our country, too. Great institutions like this, the great legacy of our past, and that love can be a conquering love that can motivate other problems. One of my rules in life is that knowledge is plentiful, but motivation is scarce. There's a famous case, I'm sure many of you know this letter, but it summarizes what I think will save us. It was a letter written by Sullivan Ballou in 1861 before the First Battle of Manassas in the Civil War. Ballou was from Maine. His folks had died when he was little. He knew what it was like to grow up in an orphanage. And he was about to go into battle at the First Battle of Manassas. And he wrote to his wife, Sarah, "My love for you is deathless. It seems to bind me to you with mighty cables that nothing but omnipotence could break. Yet my love of country comes over me like a strong wind and bears me irresistibly on with all these chains to the battlefield. I know how strongly American civilization now leans upon the triumph of the government, and how great a debt we owe to all those who went before us through the blood and suffering of the Revolution. And I am willing, perfectly willing, to lay down all my joys in this life to help maintain this government and to pay that debt." And of course, he did die the next day. But it's a reminder of all the things we owe to the past and to the country around us. And one of the things, we are driven by this heart and soul to bond with each other. It's our natural inclination. So you have to believe that the depths of our nature will prevail, and that even in a moment of isolation and loneliness and division, we'll find a way to bond through love and affection. Thank you. Now we can talk about Paul Manafort for 20 minutes.
We do know that some Chautauquans will be going off to other things, and we ask that you do so quietly if you have to do that. But also know that as we're collecting questions from the audience, that we also are joined by folks that may submit questions via Twitter using the hashtag CHQ2018. David, so much to unpack, and in some ways I hope the Manafort question doesn't come at all. Well, we have been spending last season, this season, talking about how do we talk with one another again, and you've given us some prescriptions, and it's in some ways easy to practice and unpack here for the reasons you articulated. We go to a specific place that has a mythology, and we talk to one another, and we spend overnight. The question that we so often get is, when we go back through the gates, how do we take it back to our communities? What's your counsel and advice? What have you seen? If you were to share with everyone here that's exploring this question of American identity, who then goes back to a community not wrestling, what can they do?
Yeah. The first thing I'd say is, I have a favorite couplet from Samuel Johnson. Of all the things that human hearts endure, how few are those that kings can cause and cure. And what he meant by that, politics is important. I spent a lot of time in politics. But politics is not really the most important part of life. Our relationships are more important. Our character is more important. The strength of our community bonds. Do we have trust with one another? And so to me, we can fight about politics all day. But when I go to a great community organization in Burlington, Vermont, which is super blue, or I go to one in Shreveport, Louisiana, which is super red, it doesn't feel that different. So there's a foundational health that's underneath. And so one of the things that we can do is just create, I do think it's important that we all become members of a community filled with people unlike ourselves. And so Robert Putnam has a concept of bonding capital. How do we create tight communities, but also bridging capital? If you're a super lefty, go join an organization that involves the NRA. Don't talk about guns. Talk about the community you're going to build together. And so those organizations that are social, we're going to have a social repair and a personal repair before we have a political repair. But there has to be some elemental level of trust. And so that just joining those organizations, taking part in these amazing community builders. The second thing, at my Aspen project, we're looking for these people. We're looking for people who are building social capital, who are creating intimate connection. And if you know of anybody, my email, and this is my real email, is david.brooks@aspeninstitute.org. Just write me. I'll write you back, and you can tell me something we should celebrate, somebody in your community who's doing wonderful work.
I'd just like to remind you, as a community that has my email, they will.
I've got an auto advance. It goes right to you anyway.
What current politicians do you feel are working to build community and collaboratively solve problems facing our country? Who are the exemplars out there in your mind?
Well, you heard from Jim and Deb Fallows, and so on the local level, those people are easy to find. On the national level, my basic view is that we have good people in government who are stuck in a rotten system. And so Ben Sass is a senator from Nebraska who's just a very honorable, admirable, brave man. My hero, who's ill, is John McCain, who I covered all those years. And McCain was interesting, because he didn't care. He took me out to shoot craps. Like, what politician takes a journalist to shoot craps at a casino? And he was very impatient and energetic, so I won $300, and there was a line in the cashier thing. I'm not a gambler. So he said, I'm not waiting in line. So I had to walk out of the casino with $300 in chips, which I never recovered. But what he had was, because of his experience in the prison camps, he had an inner conscience. And he sometimes violated it for political gain, but he knew when he did. He never lied to himself, and that's super valuable. But I would say in general, as I look around, Rod Wyden from Oregon, I'm a big admirer of Amy Klobuchar, a Democratic senator from Minnesota. One of the things I'll say about her is a lot of politicians in the old days, they were just artificial. They talked to you like they were talking to 5,000 people, like you were just one of the crowd. Amy Klobuchar, like a lot of senators, is super normal. The one story I tell about her, which is good. I like normalcy. I was flying back from Minnesota to D.C. one day, and I happened to be bumped up to first class, and she was sitting next to me. Because she's a senator, she went back to work the plane, like to shake hands, people back in the plane. And she comes back up to the first class cabin, and the flight attendant says, "I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't come back here and sit down up here." And so the empty seat next to me, and she looks at me, imploring me to say, "Well, this is her seat." And instead I said, "I've never seen this woman before in my life." So you could feel comfortable joking with her because she's like a real human being. And I would say, being a politician is not that glamorous. They wouldn't do it if they didn't love their country. It's just they're stuck in a rotten system that forces them to behave in ways they hate.
Questioner is asking you to elaborate more on the notion that civic movements don't often have leaders now as they may have in the past. And they say, I fear that all these civic movements are trying to address the ills of the country are also so fragmented and leaderless that they might be ineffective. We've seen movements that have started and then petered out. How do you see that playing out, and do these civic movements truly need leaders to ultimately be effective?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And when you talk to people in these organizations, and by the way, if you talk to any college student, one of the things I wanted to know who was going to build the country, what change agents do they believe in? And so the first question I would ask them was, who are your heroes? And that always preceded a long silence, because they really had trouble thinking of who their heroes were, because this is an institution that has been, a generation that's been failed by one institution after another, and they have very little faith in institutions or heroes. Eventually somebody would say Pope Francis, and then somebody else would say Ellen DeGeneres or something like that. But when you got into when you asked them, who do you believe in to change, it was always super local. It was this teacher, that person in the suicide hotline, that volunteer. Those are the only people with credibility to lead change these days. But then they struggle, and the students all struggle with this. Well, how do you maintain voice for your movement? How do you maintain coherence? The Occupy movement fell apart because it had no structure and institutional presence. One person can change history or change an idea, but if you want something to last, you have to build an institution. So what they're all trying to do is experiment with leadership, but that's hidden. So I mentioned Mac McCarter in Shreveport. If you go to his website, it will not say Mac McCarter, founder and CEO. He's like listed number 30, and he's just coordinator. And so you have these, what I've come to think of as disappearing leaders. They're leaders, they set the ethos, but it's not command and control. They just set the vision, and they're radically decentralized. So what they're trying to do is mix old power, which is hierarchical, and new power, which is decentralized. And frankly, one of the people who figured this out was Donald Trump, in a weird way. His campaign, the way he talked, it's all me, it's all about me, you need me, only I can do this. But if you actually looked at his campaign, there was no organized structure. It was just a bunch of people on Facebook. And so there's a book called The New Power by Henry Timms, and they say he's what we call a new power strongman. He comes across as authoritarian, but he's using means that are radically decentralized and high-tech and modern.
So a question from Twitter. As a millennial who feels that lack of moral and spiritual inheritance, I understand that community can solve loneliness, but how does it affect spirituality or our nation's spiritual health?
Good question. So how does spiritual formation happen? To me, it happens through, this is like a half-hour question, but I will say some things that happens there are some certain spiritual disciplines, the fasting. I would say it happens through two things for me. It happens through reading spiritual books that expose your depth. And I always recommend to young people reading a Viktor Frankl book, Man's Search for Meaning. And Frankl was a psychologist who was imprisoned in concentration camps, and he said, hey, this wasn't what I wanted from life, but so I realized, what do I want from life is the wrong question to ask. The right question is, what does life ask of me? And so what problem was I born to solve? And so that's a different and less self-centered way of looking at life. I teach courses on how to do spiritual development for young people, and one term at Yale I taught 14 books, and one of them was Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness. And the final assignment was to say, okay, take any of the 14 books we've read and apply them to a problem in your own life. And out of my 24 students, 19 picked Dorothy Day's The Long Loneliness. Why was that? Because she had an early disorganized childhood. She was the sort of person who read novels but couldn't only read them, she had to act them out. And unfortunately, she read a lot of Dostoevsky. And so what happened was she, to suicide attempts, to abortions, a really messed up life. And then she had a birth of her daughter, a single mom, and she wrote a memoir of what it was like to give birth. And at the end of the memoir, I'm going to butcher the quote, she says something like, if I had sculpted the greatest sculpture, composed the greatest symphony, or written the greatest novel, I could not have felt the more exalted creator than I did when they placed my child in my arms. With this flood of love and joy came a need to worship and to adore. And she said, who do I have to thank for this great joy? And she decided it was God. She became a Catholic, and she spent the next 60 years not only serving the poor, but living with the poor as a Catholic worker. And so you find the thing that you are most grateful for, the cause that exemplifies moral beauty more than anything else. And then you try to follow that beauty. I could go on forever on the subject, but two things. Plato has a concept of how to educate for moral transformation. And the first, he says, what you want to do is you want to take a kid and show them a beautiful face. And when they see a beautiful face, they'll say, that's beautiful, but there's an even higher beauty, which is a beautiful personality. And when they see a beautiful person, they'll think, that's a beautiful thing, but there's an even higher beauty, which is a beautiful society, which is justice. And when they see a higher beauty, they'll think, well, justice is beautiful, but there's an even higher beauty, which is truth. And when they see that beauty, they'll see the highest beauty, which is the transcendent divine beauty to which nothing can be added and nothing can be taken away. And his argument is that the soul yearns for beauty higher and higher, and if you show it an example of moral beauty, whether it's Fred Rogers, King David, or Jesus Christ, the soul will want to be and please that beauty. And so it's an aesthetic education that tends to pull people upward. I forgot what my second thing was now.
So we have several questions, both from from among our audience as well as Twitter, that is wrestling with the next phase of your argument. So we buy the argument that in community we're able to put some of this back together, that civic groups and towns and local identities can help drive this. Several are struggling with two prongs of the next level as we get up in the divide around national politics. What is the next step in that ladder that takes us from local healing to an ability to have a national dialogue? Is the macro, and on the micro, how is it that community members can even talk to divided families, which always seems to break down once we get to, is it Trump versus Clinton?
Yeah. Well, first, how does culture shift? When we have a lot of examples. In 1962, the Port Huron movement wrote the Port Huron Statement, which was a statement of what the 60s would then become. They just wrote down the ideas, it was attractive to people, and people followed. Around the same time, there was a guy named Stuart Brand, who he loved the Back to the Soil movement. Remember the communes in the 60s? He created something called the Whole Earth Catalog. And that was the toolkit for the commune movement, and he created basically the hippie culture. He created the Grateful Dead, a lot of the gatherings, a lot of the acid, and he created that culture. And then the commune movement fell apart. And he said, well, communes aren't going to be the key to our community, but there are these other people in Menlo Park called the Homebrew Computing Club. Maybe computers will be the new thing. And so in 1972, he wrote a piece for Rolling Stone magazine called The Rise of the Hacker Culture. And he created the culture of Silicon Valley, what we think of as Steve Jobs wearing the black T-shirt and Microsoft and all that. And he's a man who shifted the culture twice in one lifetime. And he did it by celebrating a cool way to live and inspiring other people to follow. So you can do that. two final things. One, to have confidence that it will happen. There's a social theorist, and I've forgotten her name. She says cultures move forward in what she calls the ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet process. We solve a problem, we create a culture that's right for the moment, and it works for a little while. Individualism, collectivism, it stops working after a while. And so you have to chop it up. And so those moments when you chop up the old culture are bumpy. 1968, 1932, 1848, today. And so it seems like, oh, we're going into decline. But never underestimate human ingenuity. We'll figure out a culture, and then we'll ratchet up again. That's just been our history, and it's frankly been most of human history. And so one of the things we have to do is figure out a new culture of commitment to each other, a new culture of personalism and connection. But to do that, you have to have a certain attitude about politics, that politics is a competition between partial truths. If you base your whole life identity on your political identity, you're asking politics to bear more than it can. And you will become a fanatic, and you'll be unable to talk to other people. And we have a lot of people who've been stripped away. An idol is putting a means as an ultimate end. And the danger of idolatry is that in the beginning it seems to work. You seem to get some pleasure from that first martini. But as idolatry goes along, it asks more and more of you and gives less and less. So eventually it asks, if you're an alcoholic, it asks for everything, it gives you nothing. And addiction to politics is the same. And so we have to multiply our identities. But to get there, the final thing I'll say, it's super important to A, impugn positive intention to everybody, unless proven otherwise, and B, be super sensitive to all the trigger words that seem to be out there in our culture. I've noticed this is a great organization called Better Angels that brings reds and blues together. And they've learned that you just got to be careful. You can't use words like dialogue or diversity, because a lot of the reds will think, if you use that word dialogue, you're just inviting me in to shout at me. And so you've got to just be super respectful of how people are hearing words in ways you can't even imagine.
Two last things. One is apologies, a correction for those going to Kimberly Hamlin's post-lecture conversations. That's going to be at Herbert Sanctuary now that Smith Roads. And the last thing is, it gives me great joy to welcome you back after 5 years. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you.